Chapman here from Mindfulness. I'd like to talk to you today about a few different concepts relating to mindfulness. So the idea of mindfulness, how it relates to meditation, and how that compares to the idea of flow in skilled experience and sports performance. And then talking a bit about a concept in Japanese martial arts pedagogy called Mushin, or no-mindedness, and how that relates to the others. So first of all, I've been listening to an excellent podcast by Hazel Findlay from StrongMind Climbing. She recently interviewed Sue Jackson, who's an expert in flow experience and applying that within a sports context to optimize people's performance. And I want to talk a bit about how meditation, mindfulness and flow fit together, where their similarities are and how they're different. Let's review some concepts first of all. So mindfulness is non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. An idea of holding thoughts and feelings lightly in your attention without judging yourself, without being too self-critical. Having an awareness of your experience both internally and a sense of interoception, an understanding of how you relate to your environment, exteroception, and perhaps also, if you're moving or performing in sport, a sense of proprioception, or how your body is moving. So meditation, in that sense, is a really good way of practicing the skill of mindfulness, but they're not the same thing. I was interested to hear in her podcast with Hazel Findlay talking to Sue Jackson. Hazel mentioned that she thought there was a difference between a mindful attention and flow experience. And flow experience, in that sense, is a kind of mindful automaticity when you're doing skilled performance. What Hazel suggested was that being mindful was about observing thoughts and feelings, whereas when you're in flow, there's an experiential being in the moment. So she figured that the mindful attention was somewhat more observational than the flow experience that she experienced during elite climbing. I can see the point, but I think what she was really comparing there was the experience of meditation and flow. And meditation and mindfulness, in my opinion, aren't the same thing. Meditation is a really good way of practicing the skill of being mindful, but they are different. In that regard, when you're doing a mindful meditation, for example, focusing on the breath, you're observing thoughts, feelings and sensations. That observation in itself is good practice. It can help distance you from the immediacy of difficult thoughts and feelings. But it's not quite the same as mindful attention. The mindful attention is more like a concept of choiceless awareness in meditation, when rather than necessarily observing or thinking about your thoughts or feelings, you're just letting your experience and awareness notice what's arising in your consciousness. You're not really observing what's arising, you're just aware of it experientially. So I think in a sense there is a benefit in meditation to observing thoughts and feelings and perhaps also labeling them to create a sense of distance from difficult thoughts and feelings. However, that's not quite the same as the kind of the immediacy of the experiential awareness of being in the moment that I think that mindfulness implies. So in that regard, I think meditation is a really good way of practicing the skill of mindfulness, but there are different elements such as observation of thoughts and labeling that are related but not quite the same thing as being mindful. So I thought it was really interesting to hear about the relationship between mindfulness and flow experience. In my opinion, mindfulness is a precursor to flow. Flow is the idea of being in the zone, of the way in which you hold your experience lightly in your attention, and that you're performing a skilled activity with a sense of mindful automaticity. I think that kind of mindful automaticity is kind of key for me. In many skilled performance activities that are physical, we can have a sense of automaticity, but it's not necessarily mindful. A good example here is in driving. When we learn to drive, we're taught that we need to be aware of our environment. We need to be aware of the person crossing the road ahead of us, the child running out behind a van, the braking speed of the car in front of us. And we do that to a certain extent when we drive, when we're experienced drivers. But sometimes, for example, we may intend to drive to the supermarket, but instead we end up at our workplace. And in that sense, I think many people have had that experience of intending to drive to one location and ending up in a more familiar one. That suggests that you're driving on automatic pilot. That in a way is mindless automaticity rather than mindful automaticity. And I think that's a very different sense. So I don't think flow is just automaticity in itself. It's important that it's mindful, that you're aware of both your own experience and your environment and are able to adapt to your environment when you're doing that skilled physical activity, be that driving, sport, music, for example. In that regard, I think that the relationship between meditation and flow is quite interesting. So in each of those circumstances, if you're meditating or if you're doing, in my case, karate or climbing, for example, you're looking at the skilled activity. You're applying mindfulness to an activity. When you're meditating, you're applying the skill of mindfulness to the activity of observing the body and being in the moment. You're holding your thoughts and feelings lightly in your attention, and then applying that to the skilled activity of observing yourself with a sense of non-judgment is how I think you're applying the skill of mindfulness in the skilled activity of meditation. In a similar way, when you're doing a sport, be that climbing, karate, football, etc., you're still, in terms of a flow experience, aiming to apply the mindset of mindfulness to that skilled activity. You're aiming for that mindful automaticity. I think in this regard there's a really interesting relationship between mastery and flow. Thinking about Japanese martial arts pedagogy, when you teach karate or learn karate, there's kind of a distinction between learning and training. Training in a karate lesson is when you do lots of repetition of basic techniques in order to instill the physical movement in the body through muscle memory. In that sense, after many repetitions, there's no longer a need to think about how you're moving the body. There's just a sense of automaticity. You have an intention and then you do the movement. And I think that at its core, flow is about that integration of action and intention. You're not kind of reflectively thinking about how you need to perform. You have an intention to do an activity or a task, and then the body follows with a sense of automaticity. In karate, a good example of that is when you perform a kata or form. You practice a form such as Basai Dai, a well-known black belt kata, often done for first dan. And because you've practiced that kata repeatedly over many years, rather than thinking, oh, now I need to perform a kick, or now I need to perform a block, you just have the intention of performing the kata and the body follows that intention. In a way, mastery is when you've done so much training that you have that sense of mindful automaticity, which is at the heart of the flow experience. And that can be really helpful in competition, for example. There's a difference, as I said, between learning and training. So when you're training the body, sort of high repetition of basic techniques in order to instill the sense of movement and technical accuracy in the body for the sport. Learning, on the other hand, is when you're trying to conceptually understand a technique. In that sense, I think you would be doing lower number of repetitions, but with higher quality. You're trying to conceptually understand the nature of the movement. I think that often comes when you're doing more complicated techniques. In karate, it would be if you're doing a number of techniques in a combination, then you maybe break it down, think about the body position, the taisabaki, think about the foot movement, ashisabaki, think about the timing of the different, maybe if you're doing a jab, cross, kick, for example. You'd be thinking about all of those things, the body position, foot movement, the breath, and the performance of the technique. And you then put them together. But to do the learning stage, you're thinking conceptually and doing a low number of high quality repetitions, whereas training is trying to instill the basic technique in the body. I think that applies to climbing too. I'm a recreational climber. I think in that regard, I don't necessarily apply what I teach yet, but I have it in my mind. In that regard, I can see how a level of mastery in climbing applies the same thing as I have applied in my martial arts, that after many repetitions, you're able to read the routes, not so much in terms of reflectively, but more as a musician reads music on the page. A musician doesn't think, oh, that note is a C, that note is a D. They see the shape of the music and they can interpret scales or arpeggios within a piece of music. In the same way, I think an experienced climber would be able to read a problem or a route, to see the shape of the holds and to almost intuitively understand the techniques that would be needed to climb that route. So I think with a degree of mastery that comes both through training and learning, that will facilitate more frequently the idea of flow, because instead of having to reflect and think about what you're doing, an experienced climber could have an intuitive sense of what's needed, and in that sense, rather than pausing, pondering, thinking about what is needed, you could also do so with a sense of that mindful automaticity. So I think that's what experienced climbers and experienced martial artists are aiming at when they're looking to elicit flow experience. And there are a couple of concepts in the Japanese martial arts pedagogy and philosophy of karate and other martial arts that are useful for considering in terms of mindfulness and flow. One of these concepts is Mushin, or no-mindedness, or to give it its proper term, Mushin no Shin, or the mind of no mind. It's a concept drawn originally from Zen Buddhism, but is applied often in martial arts contexts. So Mushin, I think, is relatively similar to the idea of mindfulness. When I first started learning about this concept in training in martial arts, I thought about no mind as meaning not thinking. Likewise, I had the misconception that mindfulness was about not having any thoughts. Whereas in fact, thoughts come and thoughts go. It's about not holding on to thoughts, feelings or sensations, letting them arise but letting them go. And in no-mindedness, I think the key is, as I've been saying, that idea of integration of action and intention. You've trained the body so much through repetition that the techniques are instilled in the body. So when you have an intention to perform a certain combination, you don't need to cognitively think what the combination is. You just have an intention and the body flows and follows your intention. So I think the idea of no-mindedness is about having that sense of mindful awareness of yourself in an environment, the panoramic specificity of awareness to be able to adapt to that environment, and then applying that high level of skill within the performance. And that can relate to form or kata in karate, for example. The performance of it's almost like a dance that karateka perform, a series of techniques of kicks, punches and blocks that are kind of judged by the level of intensity and technical accuracy. Or it could also be within sparring, within kumite. So in kumite, that's more of an open skill. You're fighting against an opponent. You don't know what the opponent's going to be doing. However, you can still have that sense of mindful automaticity. You've trained the techniques and combinations, timings, footworks, body movement in the kihon, in the basics of your karate sessions, so that when you're faced with a certain technique, combination or opponent, you're able to respond with a sense of automaticity. In that sense, you don't necessarily think, and now I need to perform a head block when someone punches to my head, or now I need to do a muwashigeri if you want to kick them to the side of the head. You simply are aware of have a sense of awareness of timing and space, and intuitively know that this is a good time to perform that technique because of the months, years of training and repetitions that you've done. I think the same would apply to other sports as well. In a climbing environment, the more experience that you have on the wall, the more you're able to better read the roots. In that regard, flow experience isn't necessarily shown if you're trying to problem solve, to read the boulder problem, or to red point a rope problem, for example. But I think that there are moments of flow that can be experienced when you've done that problem solving, when you've done the thinking, and then you're then trying to just integrate action and intention on the wall. So I think in that regard, the idea of Mushin in martial arts can be applied more widely to other sports. It kind of crosses over between mindfulness and flow, the idea of being no-minded, again not thinking, but it's that integration of action and intention in terms of the experience of performing a skilled activity, be that sport, music, or even meditation.